Ah, at last! A man born in a more lowly state than myself.
Cromwell, I knew there was something about you that I didn't like.
I swear to be a true and faithful counsellor to the King's Majesty as one of His Highness's Privy Council. You'll not find any talent I possess that England cannot use.
I trust in your discretion and your skill.
You made a mistake threatening me, sir.
Hi everybody, it's been a B007 back for a 10-minute movie review, except today I'm talking about the new TV miniseries Wolf Hall, based on the wildly successful and critically acclaimed novels by Hilary Mantel about Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn, as told from the perspective of Thomas Cromwell, a piece of marvellous historical fiction that was radically revisionist in casting Cromwell, the bogeyman of history, as a loving father, a loyal servant to Cardinal Wolsey, and a really enigmatic and fascinating figure. This new TV production has been created by the BBC in collaboration with PBS. It'll be shown on BBC Two from January the 21st and in America from April 5th, and features an all-star cast. Homeland's Damian plays King Henry VIII, and I must say that with his red hair he suits the role completely. A young actress called Claire Foy plays Anne Boleyn, and again just portrays her prickly pomposity, certainly in the first 2 episodes of the 6-part miniseries, which is as much as I have seen on preview. You might remember her from the reboot of Upstairs, Downstairs, which sadly was cancelled. I think it fell victim to coming out at the same time as Downton Abbey, and unfortunately its prickly historical realism didn't sit well against the conservative aristo-fantasy that is Downton. The miniseries also features Jonathan Pryce as Cardinal Wolsey. Mark Gatiss, for those of you who are fans of the BBC's Sherlock, plays Stephen Gardner, the courtier who was once loyal to Wolsey but abandons him. And for Game of Thrones fans, we see Harry Lloyd, who played Viserys, as Anne Boleyn's former lover Harry Percy, and we also see Thomas Brodie Sangster, who plays the ill-fated Jojen Reed, as Thomas Cromwell's ward. And last but not least, we have Mark Rylance as Thomas Cromwell himself. Now, Mark Rylance may not be familiar to you if you watch US TV or go to the movies more often, because he's principally known as a theatre actor and director. He was director at the Globe Theatre in London for many years. And indeed, one of the best productions of Shakespeare and performances I've ever seen was when Mark Rylance did an all-male version of Antony and Cleopatra. And he played Cleopatra. And the first 10 minutes, of course, it seemed slightly absurd and weird and funny. But then the power of his performance just totally swept you away, and I was utterly transfixed by him. He also starred in a TV miniseries called The Government Inspector. That was also directed by Peter Kosminski, who directs Wolf Hall. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Hilary Mantel novels, why should you watch yet another TV production based on the life of King Henry VIII, his marriage to Anne Boleyn? After all, we've recently sat through The Tudors, many films such as The Other Boleyn Girls, so much historical fiction on this time. Well, for a start, Hilary Mantel is one of the greatest writers in English literature currently living, I firmly believe, and she tells her story with great historical research and a fresh perspective, which is Thomas Cromwell's perspective. And the technical brilliance of her books is to show it deeply embedded in his perceptions and his perspective. And indeed, I suspect this might prove difficult for people, certainly in the first episode of this TV series, because you're expecting to see Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and you don't, really, because Thomas Cromwell has not yet risen to meet them in the flashback scenes that show his rise to power. He is but Cardinal Wolsey's shadowy helpmeet. And so you only see Henry VIII briefly in flashback at the trial of Queen Catherine of Aragon. And you only see Anne Boleyn in a final, very pivotal scene where you see this very powerful, pompous woman condescending towards a man who is opaque and enigmatic. We get the feeling that he's a man not to be messed with. Everyone mocks him for his poor and humble origins. And we know that he's had this shadowy period where he's been on the continent. He speaks languages. He knows about trade. We suspect he might have been a mercenary soldier. And yet we know very little about him, because Thomas Cromwell is a courtier who knows how to present a face to the world depending on who he speaks, while, and this is so clever, seeming to be the one man who is incorrupted, who can speak truth to power. And that, I think, is what attracts Henry VIII to him. But anyway, that's jumping ahead a little bit. Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall brings a perspective on Tudor England that is educated, intelligent, and comes from a fresh perspective. And what I love about Peter Kosminski's translation of that to the screen is that he keeps the immediacy, the freshness, the urgency. This doesn't feel like yet another staged, formal costume drama that's self-consciously epic and portentous, where the figures are grand historical figures. You know, when we see the family, the Cromwell family, sitting having breakfast and the wife clearing everything away, and his little daughter sitting on his knee reading a book, it feels casual and intimate and real. And I think Kosminski has to be praised by the fluidity of his camera work, for the way he always looks over Cromwell's shoulders, putting him very firmly in the centre of this drama, as Hilary Mantel's book has him at the centre of her novels. I love the fact that they've used the real historical palaces of England to shoot in open air wherever possible, and that when you have interiors, they may be lushly dressed and beautifully costumed, the people in this series, but somehow they feel intimate and real, candlelit, and close and claustrophobic sometimes. But this is a slow-paced drama. It's densely packed. It makes no compromises for the viewer. The structure of the first episode in particular starts off in 1529, which is the point at which Cardinal Wolsey, the most powerful man in England, arguably, he's head of the Catholic Church in England, he's Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor, he's amassed great estates, and, as a low-born man, has incurred the wrath of the aristos. He's about to be pulled down, and Thomas Cromwell is his loyal servant. So the events begin in 1529, the fall of Wolsey, but they flash back to 1523 when Anne Boleyn runs off with Harry Percy, this basically sort of lower aristo middle-class girl who aspires to a great marriage, and Wolsey's putting an end to it. And then we move forwards with flashbacks to, as I said before, Catherine of Aragon's trial, even to the childhood of Thomas Cromwell himself. Sometimes it's hard to tell quite where and when we are in the TV episode. And I think it's because the director hasn't chosen. Sometimes when you have flashback scenes, the director chooses to film them slightly differently, you know, different colour palettes, just to make it very visually obvious to the viewer where we are. But that's not the case with Wolf Hall. And there are occasions when you do have a little credit sort of title saying this is where we are and this is when we are, but that's not always the case, and I think you do have to pay very close attention. I'd read the books many times and struggled a little bit to keep up, and the friend with whom I watched it, who hadn't read the novels, the first thing she said is, I need to, watch this on TV when it comes on. It really plays a close and repeated viewing, I think, in sharp contrast to the typical more beautiful but not intellectually demanding Sunday night sort of costume dramas of the month. But I do think it's worth investing that time and attention, because this is a beautifully crafted, beautifully written drama. The acting performances are superb. Mark Rylance captures that enigma and slipperiness of Cromwell. You see why his family would love him, but you also see why the aristos just didn't know quite how to pigeonhole him. They couldn't put their finger on him. And you also see him being very charismatic and forceful. You see why Henry VIII would put his faith in this man. I also really love Damian Lewis as Henry VIII. I think Hilary Mantel shows him very fragile and vulnerable and embattled. He's a man caught in the net of Catholic dogma, his own faith, and this incredibly demanding mistress. And he's trapped, and you really get that and really sympathise with him. But you also, in a sense, by the end of the second episode of this series, I think, feel some contempt for him, because he is just so weak in this environment. I also really love Claire Foy as Anne Boleyn. I think she perfectly encapsulates that cool, calculating, slightly vulnerable, because she's so paranoid it won't come off, this grab for power. I think it's going to be interesting to see how in episodes 3 through 6 she gets our sympathy as her world starts to come down. And then the other key roles, I think, the only one that actually disappointed me was Jonathan Pryce as Cardinal Wolsey. I think he was sort of physically as well as in terms of his character too lightweight. I know we're starting off from the point of his fall, but this is still the most powerful man in England, a man greatly feared. And he just felt too light, too whimsical, too almost delusionary in sort of how he thinks every next scheme is going to deliver Henry what he wants. He felt like a vulnerable child that Cromwell had to nurse and pander to almost. And I know a lot of that is in the novel, but there was just something about Jonathan Pryce that felt very small, and actually in the way in which he delivered his lines, almost anachronistic. And I know that this whole production is trying to make the history feel fresh, so it shouldn't feel sort of declamatory. But yes, Jonathan Pryce as Wolsey, definitely, I felt that was maybe miscast or misdirected, I don't know. Behind the lens, as I've said, I really love the shooting style of this film. I can't speak highly enough of the production design. The way in which the tapestries and fabrics of the costumes are used is so beautiful and sensuous. It's just a treat to be in that world. But as I said, patient and maybe repeated viewing to get the full detail and density, unpacking the plot. Because actually I'm going to end this by talking about Peter Strawn, who adapted these wonderful novels by Hilary Mantel. You know, he's got 6 hours to convey the complete richness and density of not one but 2 Booker Prize-winning novels. And I think he has done it amazingly. I mean, in watching the first 2 episodes, which, if you know the novels, take us from the fall of Wolsey up until the point where Thomas Cromwell is now a member of the Privy Council, and he's watching what will be a very pivotal satirical masque at court, where the people who have brought Wolsey down are dressed up as wolves and are sort of mocking Wolsey in effigy. So this is a very pivotal moment, because it's when Cromwell is literally going to see who unmasks themselves and who has been part of that plot to bring down his beloved master, and who therefore he will be revenged upon. So that's the scope of these first 2 episodes. But I didn't watch those and feel that I was missing anything from the novels, and I think Peter Strawn really has to be congratulated on his adaptation that feels so faithful while still being cinematic, while still allowing us as viewers to follow what's happening. Far better actually in episode 2 than in episode 1, which sticks more closely to the sort of present day, being 1529, of the novel. So overall, I can't speak highly enough of Wolfhall. I think I'm fascinated to see what the final 4 episodes bring. But by episodes 1 and 2, which is a third of the show, I can strongly, strongly recommend it. So I hope you all watch it, and if you agree or disagree with my take, then please feel free to leave a comment at the blog, B007.com, and I will post another review once the series has finished. So once again, just with the release information, Wolfhall will be broadcast in the UK on BBC Two starting on Tuesday the 21st of January at 9 p.m, and it will be shown in the USA on PBS starting on April the 5th. Thank you for listening.
Now is the time for you to become the king you should be.
Aren't you afraid?
What?
Those who've been made can be unmade.
I keep you because you are a serpent. Everything that you are, everything that you have, will come from me.
Wolfhall, a 6-part drama based on the novels by Hilary Mantel on BBC Two and BBC Two HD.